I'd like to introduce Dr. John Flanagan. He's a professor of government and history at Weatherford College. He is presenting a program today, Communism, Socialism, Fascism, Kleptocracy, and Thugs. And I know everyone is going to really enjoy it. I know I will. John?
Well, thank you. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody. I hope you all are enjoying the conference so far. It's been very good. Have to thank Scott Tarnowiecki for putting this together again for us. But today, what we're going to do in this session is we are going to look at, as the name would imply, communism, socialism, fascism, kleptocracy, and thugs. Basically, what we're doing here, this came from an idea that we use these words a lot in the political arena today. People are constantly throwing these words around kind of very loosely at each other. And so what we're doing here is we're going to try and get a better idea of what these words actually mean. Now, again, the reason why they're used that way is because rhetorically, it's very powerful. If you can paint your political rival as a communist or socialist or a fascist, it can carry a lot of weight, particularly in democratic politics. So we are going to try and get a more precise meaning, right? Now, again, since I'm a political scientist, we in the discipline have some meanings, particular meanings that we ascribe to these words. So that's what we are going to do. First of all, those first three things, we're going to look at the first three elements first: communism, socialism, fascism, but not in that order. Those are ideologies, right? Those are political ideologies. And the thing to remember about an ideology is this: ideologies hold certain base assumptions about how politics should be organized. And it's off of those base assumptions that the rest of their structure, governmental structure and ideas come out of. So the goals then, the assumptions then will dictate what the goals of those particular ideologies are. Now, again, the important thing here is just to understand, if you have a different set of assumptions, if you're working off a different set of assumptions, you are going to get potentially very different outcomes. And that's what we have in terms of these three ideas. Now, also too, remember that political ideologies are also utopian in their nature, right? They're basically saying that there's a problem with society, and if we just reorder things in this proper way, we'll get to that more perfect, ideal society. So there's a driving force behind any political ideology, which is to achieve this place, right? Where they want to go. So we need to keep that in mind. Now, the way that we look at political ideologies, it's a very tried and true method in political science, is by what we call the political spectrum. So this is kind of a basic idea of the political spectrum. And again, there are words here that you probably recognize if you're not a political scientist, right? And so the way to kind of understand the political spectrum is we have a line there, and in the middle we have democracy, right? Democratic liberal democratic government, right? That takes the middle position in our spectrum. Now the spectrum then moves to the right and to the left, right? And you've probably heard people talk about someone being a leftist or being on the right, right? What this does is the right and the left then are going to have positions, ideological positions on them. So if you go to the right, you end up, you kind of move out of democracy. Now remember, it's a spectrum, so it's gradiated. So you slowly kind of move out of democracy, and you get to kind of an extreme nationalism, and then you will move over, and if you continue on that line, you get to fascism. And then on the left, as you can see, as you move out of democracy, you get to socialism, which is kind of the transitional point. And then if you continue on, you get to communism. So this is the way in which we talk about the political spectrum. Now, again, there are some issues with it, and people will argue about it, and we're going to try to address those, because when we look at the spectrum like this, what we're really looking at is we're looking at the ideological differences that you'll see. You'll also notice too that when I describe the political spectrum, I tend to look at the goals of these different regime types. That's a technical term for them. And on the right, what we have regime types that become more exclusive as you get to the extremes of the spectrum, meaning that they create a groups, and those groups then are kind of placed on a hierarchy, and you have a superior group that is the dominant group, and then as you move down that hierarchy, we'll talk more about that here in a second. And on the left, the left tends to be inclusive regimes, right? With the left, what you basically get is you get the idea that society has these barriers in it between different groups, and the goal of kind of leftist regimes is to break those barriers down so everyone can be included in one large kind of homogenous group. In the end, that is its end goal. So we will talk about that in terms of exclusiveness on the right and inclusiveness on the left. But again, that is in an ideological sense. Now, again, that helps us to analyze these regimes kind of in an intellectual way, right? That's kind of the intellectual way of thinking about it. But also, too, we are going to have to look at how these regimes behave. And what we're going to find is in terms of behavior, as you move to the extremes, either right or left, behavior becomes very similar. So extreme rightist regimes and extreme leftist regimes behave very similar to each other. So we need to look a little into that as well. Also, too, remember these are the ideological regimes, but there are a lot of authoritarian, non-democratic regimes out there that are very authoritarian, but they're not ideological, right? So we have to account for that as well. So that's kind of our goal here, to kind of understand how to consider all these different regime types, these non-democratic regime types. So the first thing that we are going to look at is we're going to start our tour and we're going to go to the left. So we're going to start with socialism. Now again, socialism, and let me drop the screen here for a second. With socialism starts with the idea that society has to be considered as a collective whole, right? And that every individual is a member of a society, and makes contributions to that society. So everybody is contributing, right? And so everybody is important. That kind of idea, right? Everybody is contributing, so therefore everybody's important. So we get that kind of idea as a kind of a basis of the assumption within socialism. Now, the socialists will talk about this idea of what's called the means of production. And that is the idea that society produces certain things, and those things are necessary, right? Now, again, you get into an argument about the means of production, like what exactly denotes the means of production, what is and what isn't the means of production, in this sense, right? In this kind of for socialists, because most socialists will basically argue that there are certain things that are necessities, right? Everybody in society needs them, and therefore everyone should have access to them, and that then is guaranteed through social control. So the government then will control these particular things, and it's things like food, housing, medication, some cases transportation, communication. Again, if you sit and talk to socialists, and I've talked to several over the course of my life, they'll argue about what actually constitutes the means of production. But the one thing that drives this idea of socialism is the idea of equality. And you got to be careful here because, again, equality is a word that really politically can have two very different meanings. You can talk about equality in terms of the equality of opportunity, which means that you basically allow everyone to kind of start at the same place, and then you allow them to let their natural inclinations and skill and education and whatever to then drive what they do. A good example is like a foot race. That's the example that's usually given, right? If you run a foot race by the idea of the quality of opportunity, that means that everybody starts at the same place at the same time. So those initial conditions are the same. Off goes the starter gun, and then everybody runs. And then determining who wins the race becomes a question of who has the strength and the agility and the endurance and the speed, right? And so in the end, you will get ranked results, right? Some people will do better than others. Socialism works off of the idea of the equality of results, right? And this is basically the argument that since society is a group effort, then everyone should benefit from that. So again, if you use that foot race definition, this would be a foot race, but the people who are slower get to start maybe close, maybe they have less to run, or they start earlier, right? Maybe the people who are like really fast, maybe they have to, I don't know, wear weights or something. And so when the race starts, everybody is then running or resulting in the same pace. So at the end, everybody finishes at the same time or close to the same time, right? So when you talk about equality, you have to be very careful and describe what kind of equality you're talking about. Otherwise, you'll just talk past each other. So we will see that, and this is basically how this idea of socialism works. But again, like I said, there's a kind of a debate about what denotes the mean of productions and what you should do, because in most socialist nations you'll have government control some, but not all. They will allow the market to do other things, kind of in other industries. Again, remember, it is gradated. So you'll have some socially driven regimes in which there's not a lot of interaction, not a lot of government control, and some in which there are. Now, an important thing to say here is, remember, social policy, as we understand it, really isn't socialism. Okay, you can have policies, and again, to make that equation, to conflate those two things together, really doesn't serve a purpose, at least in intellectual, in an intellectual or analytical sense. Again, we're trying to get to more kind of precise meaning here, as to what it means. Again, you can have a place like Canada or England, which have single payer health systems, right? But they're still considered to be very healthy democracies as well. So you do see that also too. You have models. You have socialism in kind of different models. You have like the Scandinavian model, where really you kind of have a mixed type of economy there. Again, this denotes usually high taxes, because again, you got to pay for everything. Because remember, nothing is free, right? Somebody has to pay for it. So again, the way government pay for things and get their revenue is through taxation. But again, even in Scandinavia, remember, those are some of the most consolidated democracies in the world, as well. So we have that. Now, again, an important point here that will come up is, remember, modern democracies are all going to have social safety nets and social welfare systems, right? That's something that developed. It developed largely after the Second World War. There were some historical antecedents before then, but again, the social safety net and the social welfare state come under a lot of criticism. Again, just to kind of show you something. Let's see here. Hold on for 1 second. So even from the very beginning of the like in the United States, of course, the New Deal is going to be the kind of the birth of the modern welfare state. But here you can see the argument that was made even then. So we do see a lot of criticism there. But again, there is a general acceptance that some type of social safety net, right? Because again, you're going to have people in society that kind of fall through the cracks, is necessary. Now, again, how large it should be, how much it should cost, that is debated quite a bit. So we have that. But remember that we're looking at kind of gradations, right? You move towards socialism or away from socialism. So it's very hard to talk about kind of bright lines here. But again, that's important because, in reality, many systems are not have socialistic tendencies, but some more, some less. And that's how we look at those things. Now this moves us to communism. And communism is very different. Communism is kind of the brainchild of these two guys. The guy sitting down with his hand in his blazer there. That's Karl Marx, who usually gets the most credit. The other guy there is Friedrich Engels. He was kind of his. Friedrich Engels was kind of the sidekick. I always think about them as like the Batman and Robin of political ideology, but they did work together. Now, what we see here is Karl Marx is going to kind of take the social impulse of socialism, because there had been kind of socialistic ideas around before Marx, and kind of some small efforts like in communities and idealized communities that try to practice some sort of socialism. What Marx does is he takes that impulse and he creates a comprehensive theory around it. Marx theory is based on the idea of what he calls the social, the class struggle, right? Basically for Marx, and again, this is just bare bones Marx, basically he said there's a class struggle, right? If you look through history, there's been groups of haves and have-nots, and the haves repress the have-nots, right? Through various means. And what is going to happen is eventually you're going to get to a point. Now, again, he kind of sees these different kind of epochs in human history. Because you're basically going to get to a point where, and he thought they were about to be, in which you're in the final stage of history called capitalism. And you have the bourgeoisie, which is the haves, and the proletariat, which is the have-nots. And the proletariats would rise up in a revolution and unify society. They would disenfranchise the bourgeoisie, and then everything would be shared in common, and that would be communism. So you have that. Now, a couple of things that are important about Marx. Now, this is all based on this idea of economic determinism, right? That's what we call this idea, because again, Marx basically said it's all about economics, right? That was his idea. A couple of things that are important about Marx. First of all, when Marx said this, remember, he believes that this is a scientific certainty. This is a law of history, in the same way that, say, Darwin would be, right? The law of evolution or something like that. Although Marx does some thinking kind of before Darwinism, but it kind of comes together. Now, again, Marx is kind of modeling his idea off of the ideas of a guy named Hegel, a philosopher named Hegel, and his idea of the dialectic. But and Hegel is kind of the intellectual grandfather of Marx. But what Marx does is he kind of takes Hegel's idea, because Hegel basically said that history kind of moves, and you have kind of two forces, the thesis and the antithesis, and then eventually they will synthesize, and then you get another one, and you get another thesis out of that, and you kind of go through these steps. That kind of unfolding of history. The term for that is historicism. We call it, that's the name for that, right? You're basically basing this idea of growth on history and the contingency of history. So Marx kind of takes Hegel, and he then uses this economic determinism as his main engine for that, and so he sees these phases kind of throughout human history. Now, again, at the end of this unfolding of history, you would get to this end point. Hegel called this the end of history, and Marx kind of took that from him. Now, according to Marx, this would end in a revolution, right? When the proletariat would rise up against the bourgeoisie. One of the big questions that we get is, what is this revolution going to look like in Marx? And the answer is Marx was never really clear about what the revolution was going to look like. he believed that the revolution was inevitable, but if you read Marx, you kind of get kind of this two different ideas. But for the most part, Marx kind of thought it was going to kind of be organic, was just going to kind of happen, right? And it was going to be natural. He hinted that it might be violent, but that's only in some of his works. But it would be, the point was it was going to be this major change, and it might have some violence, but maybe not a lot. So that was kind of what Marx thought. Now, again, when most people think about communism, they don't go back to the original Marx. What they do is they look at the modifications made to Marx's theory by another guy, Vladimir Lenin. Now, Lenin, of course, is going to be the leader of the Russian Revolution. And that is going to be a major change, because remember, Marx was a philosopher who came up with his ideas. He literally was in the Royal Library in London, and so he had this intellectual view of what was going to happen. And again, when you're going back to that idea of the revolution, you kind of get this. Marx kind of had this kind of early Hegelian view of what was going to happen. Kind of was the freeing of human creativity, and then later he'll come back and start talking about, like, modernization being the goal of communism, which was a much more starker view. So we're kind of left with that, and Lenin picks it up because, again, remember, Lenin's isn't in the real world. He is the leader of the Russian Revolution. Marx believed that the revolution would happen in a developed area that had a very strong capitalist element working in it. And it didn't. Marx thought it was going to happen in, like, Russia, or I'm sorry, in Germany or England or some place like that, but it didn't. The first revolution, of course, was in Russia, a rather undeveloped place. So it's kind of a surprise. So Lenin then had to kind of steer and modify Marx, because the things that Marx said were going to happen really didn't happen. Now, remember, Marx thought it was scientifically it was a scientific inevitability that this was going to happen. The question became why the revolution had really happened. And according to Lenin, he said the reason is Marx. Marx let the cat out of the bag too early, and the bourgeoisie figured out that they were in trouble, so they re-entrenched. And for that reason, the revolution is going to have to be a violent thing, because the bourgeoisie are going to hang on, tooth and nail to their position. Also, too, he comes up with things like the theory of imperialism, right? Capitalist nations go out and they go out, and remember, this is the age of empires. So they go out and they create colonies in these far-flung places, and they steal from the indigenous people there, and they bring that wealth back to their home nation, and then they kind of divvy it out to the proletariat just to placate them, to keep them happy. So they're just happy enough not to agitate and revolt. So you have that. Also, too, Marx talks about this idea of what we call the Vanguard, the Proletariat. He said, look, there's only going to be a couple people who really get it. And so when the revolution comes, those people are going to have to be in charge. Now, what they'll do is, over time, they will enlighten everybody else, and the rest of the proletariat will get it. But that's going to be a process, right? So you'll see that as well. Now, again, ultimately, the vanguard of the proletariat becomes a elite governing class. In Russia, of course, it became the Communist Party. But again, you get this argument that no other politics or political parties are necessary, because the vanguard of the proletariat knows the truth, right? So anything else is just going to be a distraction. So that's what we get out of Lenin. And that's really, that kind of modification is really what is going to drive the idea of communism in the 20th century. So we do have Marxism, and then we get Leninism kind of on top of that. So that's the left. Now to the right. And this is, we're going to start actually on the end with fascism, right? Again, this is another word that's been used so much that it's basically meaningless now. The term is meaningless in many cases. Currently, when someone calls someone a fascist, it just means that it's anybody who's kind of threatened them politically, that they feel repressed by or suppressed by, right? If you don't like it, then they're probably a fascist. Again, that's a very loose use of the term, and one that's not very precise, to say the least. But again, it's important rhetorically because it's powerful. So it serves a purpose, but it doesn't do very much to help us kind of understand fascism in an analytical sense. Now, one of the problems, of course, is that fascism, unlike communism, is a little bit more difficult to define. With communism, we have the works of Marx, and there's a lot of pages that you got to read to get through Marx. But fascism is a little bit more difficult to understand. There is this view that some hold that fascism is an ideology of the political left, but it's an ideology of the political right. People who argue for the leftist idea of fascism are really non-academics, and their kind of definition is a little less rigorous. But we can place fascism solidly on the right. Now, there is a common element that fascism is a reactionary ideology. It's a reaction to modernity. So as the way that the world was forming up in terms of in the late 19th and early 20th century. So some people will say that this is a reactionary ideology, and the regimes that were fascist were reactionary. Now, that argument is based on the idea that fascism negates, right? So the argument is with fascism, what you basically get is the idea of liberal democracy, of communism, of conservatism in the European sense of the word. All of those are rejected or negated by fascism, right? So that's a very kind of strong argument about what fascism is. Now, again, that may or may not be the case. Just because you're negating stuff doesn't necessarily make you a reactionary. Some people argue that fascism just has to brush that away first, so it can then create a space for its own assumptions to go. So that might be something. Now, in a basic sense, kind of getting back to what we were talking about, fascism is a political regime in which the state and race become superior, and you will use your position as a member of the state and superior race as your central point for your political organization, right? So basically what happens is in fascist states is they will choose a group, right? And that group will become the superior group. And then they will create this kind of hierarchy of other groups, right? As you go further down that ladder, those groups become less and less desirable. And ultimately, of course, that type of hierarchical thinking is going to result in some pretty horrible things in the 20th century. Most notably, of course, the Holocaust, right? Because again, what happened was the Nazis in Germany, right, created a regime in which you had the German Aryan, right? They kind of took race and nation and kind of combined them together. They put those guys at the top, right? And then they had kind of this ranking. And of course, there were groups at the bottom of that ranking, Jews, Romani, Gypsies, and other undesirable groups that they thought were just so undesirable that it was their imperative to destroy those groups. So this is dangerous stuff that we are looking at here. Now again, kind of going back to the spectrum. Remember, we said that there's an intermediate kind of step, and that's kind of the idea of extreme nationalism. And we do see this. Actually, even today, you'll have somebody like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's viewed as an extreme nationalist. Some people call him a fascist, but he's really kind of an extreme nationalist. There is an argument that in India, the current leader there, Modi, is an extreme nationalist. He has a policy based on what he calls Hindu nationalism. So we do see these types of regimes in terms of extreme nationalism, but they haven't really crossed the line into fascism yet. So we will see that. Now, again, when you create this hierarchy kind of based on corporate identity, right, belonging to a group, right, one's merit and value come from being in that group. Okay. Now, again, another thing about this is that elite group is always threatened, right? The threat is that they could be corrupted by mixing, basically breeding with those other less desirable groups, right? So that has to be avoided at all costs, right? And you get into this kind of weird argument about blood and keeping the blood pure, but that's where that comes from, okay? Because you don't want those less than desirable groups to taint that superior element in your society, right? So in a fascist nation, what you're going to get is you're going to get individuals in that elite group that have to devote themselves to the state, okay? And, all those superior elements of a human being, strength, intelligence, endurance, whatever, are not the product of an individual. They are the product of the state working through the individual, right? So the question becomes, like for the Germans, again, why was Beethoven great? Not because he had some individual creativity in him. It's because he was German, right? And his music came out through his Germanness. So you have that. Oh, forgot. This is Lenin here, giving a speech. That's Vladimir. Also, too, the fasci, the word fascist comes from the fasci, which was from ancient Rome. Basically, was a bundle of sticks tied together with an axe blade in it. It was the symbol of authority. So, if you were a Roman official, you'd be given a fasci to show that you had received authority, or as the Romans called it, imperium. So here we have actually a carving of a fasci from ancient Rome, and that would be that's a Roman lictor, an officer, and he would carry around the fasci to show that he had power. but that's where the word actually comes from. Now, in these states, aesthetics and style and social organization are extremely important. So you'll have things like public rituals, and of course, again, here we have the Nazis. Now, again, the problem with all this is fascism took kind of national types, right? You had fascism in Germany under the Nazis. You had fascism in Italy under Mussolini. You arguably had fascism in Spain under Franco. He's kind of a maybe. But again, depending where you are, that hierarchy would be a little bit different, right? Because the Germans put the Germans on the top, the Italians put the Italians on the top. So you have that. Also in fascism, of course, you're going to have the need for a leader, because it's hard to talk about fascist regimes without talking about their leader. But again, you needed someone to translate kind of your nationness to them. What did it mean to be a German? What did it mean to be Italian, right? So you have that. There is this mystical component in fascism that we see. And because of this, what you'll get in fascist regimes, of course, is you will get a system that depends more on the leader than the governing institutions. And that, of course, leads us to the cult of personality, right, as a governing factor. And again, in most fascist regimes, when that leader dies or ends, so does the regime itself. Now, there are scholars who actually believe that fascism was really only possible in kind of that interwar period, but that's possible. That's a possibility too. Now, another thing I want to say real quick. Oh, there's our leaders. So Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco. Another thing that what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about, we were talking about these ideologies on a analytical level. We also have to look at behavior. And when we talk about behavior, what's important to kind of understand is the spectrum is a little bit different. Okay. Basically what happens is, like I said, on the extreme angles or the extreme ends of the spectrum, you get very similar behavior. So basically what happens with the spectrum then, when you're talking about behavior, how these people are going to act, how these regimes are going to act, the spectrum kind of curves around on itself. As I like to say, it's you can think about it being in curved space, kind of borrowing from the physicist, because by the time you get to the ends, a fascist regime and a communist regime, in terms of just how they behave, look very similar to each other. One more thing, and this is going to be important for us too. Remember, there are plenty of regimes out there that are just autocracies. They're not ideological. Okay. And there's plenty of them out there. These are what we are usually classify as kleptocracies, right? Klepto from the Greek meaning to be a thief. So these are regimes that are non-ideological. They don't operate under any of those ideological assumptions, and they basically just allow their leaders a way to steal and drain the state of its resources for their own personal gain. So this would be a kleptocracy. Now, sometimes kleptocracies kind of pretend to be ideological, but if you look at their behavior, they're really not. So you'll have that. Again, just to give you some examples of this, like in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, kind of in the post-colonial period, you'll see a lot of this. And again, a lot of the resources that were being drained were natural resources. So things like gold and diamonds, oil, even in some places chocolate, cocoa, were used to line the coffers of the leaders of these places. There's a political scientist, William Reno, who wrote a book about African politics. He calls it Warlord Politics. And that really gets us down to kind of the thug element, because sometimes you'll just have regimes that just simply don't even bother really to govern at all, and they're just kind of they're kind of controlled by kind of extreme kleptocrats, and their governments really just are large criminal organizations. Like in South America, you'll have what we call the narco states that basically are driven by the drug cartels. So those are the different kind of ideologies that we have out there. Real quickly, just in the last 5 minutes or so, let's talk a little bit about the different behaviors that we will see. Oh, there's Mussolini. This is there are actually five behaviors that we should talk about. One is the claim to leadership as the only alternative to national greatness, which is what many of these dictators will make. You will get the second one, which is the idea of the control of information and propaganda. The third is corruption. The fourth is violence. And the fifth is virility. And I'll have to explain that when we get there. But again, you'll get these claims, going back to the first one, you'll get these claims that the leader is the only person who can achieve greatness. So with Mussolini, you have him making claim that he was going to rebuild the Roman Empire, and so there he is next to a Roman statue there. Of course, Hitler talked about the idea of Lebensraum, that Germany had to expand out to the east. Lenin, of course, talked about economic development. Of course, Mao, you have the Great Leap Forward. And there's Mao, the idea of the Great Leap Forward that the Chinese could, through his leadership, develop very quickly. So you have that. But remember, the elite group, whomever it is going to make a claim that they represent the people, right? That the government before, particularly if it's democratic, was failing. It was corrupted. It was unresponsible to the people, and the new government, this new leadership, is the only one that can really address the issues of the people. But again, taking that idea that the people are supreme, right, and things have to be done outside of the confines of normal politics, this will give the leadership the argument that they can do anything, right, for the people. So constitutions, institutions, individual rights, none of that matters. The political process doesn't matter. None of it matters, because they are acting solely for the welfare of the people. But again, this becomes the justifications for these governments to do all the things that they do that are quite terrible. So you will see that. Now, again, in some instances, and this is kind of more of a modern current thing, you'll have these regimes that kind of keep the shell of democratic institutions kind of around them, but that's really only for the sake of appearances. So you'll have like Castro, who's the president of Cuba, or Putin, who gets elected to his office, right? Again, it's pretty hard to argue that that's genuinely democratic in what they're doing. So you have that. But again, what you basically get then is you get this attitude that the means, whatever those, or the ends, whatever the ends that are being defined are, will justify the means in these types of situation. So we will have that. But in many ways, this kind of argument for greatness is it's preordained, or it's going to happen, or something like that. Then we get propaganda, right? And again, this is kind of an effort by governments to break away people from the objective world, and anything that challenges the rule of the elite will become verboten in these types of regimes, right? Now, again, this is more than just political spin, right? Because all governments will do this to some degree or another, right? This is a much more involved attempt to basically sow confusion, create uncertainties, discourage people from critical thinking. But anything that makes the government will become the only source of information, because again, if you have anything out there that's counter to what the government is saying, that does become dangerous. So you have that. So here's, of course, Hitler and Mussolini. Again, both were great propagandists. This is probably the best summation of it. This is this picture here. You see in the back, there's this words written. This is actually an Italian fascist slogan. Crudite, obiete, combatte, which translates to believe, fight, or believe, obey, and fight. And that is, in very brief, the idea of how that idea of propaganda works. Then, of course, we know that we're going to have corruption in these regimes, which we've already talked about to a great deal. But again, there's no transparency and there's no oversight, right? And the leaders or the elite group can use those resources, natural resources and national resources, in any means that they want to. Now, in many ways, this is also part of how the leadership is structured. Because remember, they're going to need some they're going to need some elements in their society that are going to back them. And so in many instances, what they will do is they will kind of divvy up these resources amongst themselves and their partners. And again, this is, in many cases, this would be like the military, if the leaders, well, many of the leaders are in the military, but the military could be certain individuals or influential groups, in some cases religious authorities, right? But again, they need to be a source of wealth and goods to entice these groups to continue to support them. So we have that. Fourth, of course, we have violence, right? We know that these types of regimes are extremely violent. Again, violence is used as a military, as a political tool, right? So of course you'll see large militaries, paramilitary groups, secret police, special security forces that are used to regulate everybody else in society. And again, it can be used domestically against your own populations. It can be used internationally against other countries as well. But again, violence is always present in these types of regimes. Then you get virility, and again, this is kind of a claim that's made by the leadership, or if you have a single, if you have an individual in charge, these people become the symbols and the paragons of virtue and masculinity. Because again, in all these instances, we're dealing with male leaders. I'm sure if we're a female leader, we probably have the same thing. But you will see this. Let me give you a couple of examples here. Here we have the shirtless leader. I saw these and I kind of thought about it. So the black and white there, that's Mussolini working out in the fields. This is sometime in the late 1920s, early 30s. And then on the other side there, of course, you have Vladimir Putin, right? Both of them are kind of displaying their masculinity, their manliness, right? By running around shirtless. So we will see that. Also, too, like in names, we'll see this as well. For example, Stalin. Stalin was not Stalin's name. He took that name. He was given name. His given name was Lesky Lozvanovich was his name. He took the name Stalin. Stalin in Russian means steel. So he literally was steel. In Russia, he was usually referred to as the man of steel. So you have that. But it's about time to go. And just to end off, my favorite name of a dictator. This is Joseph Desiree Mobutu. He was the president of Zaire, which was the Congo, became Zaire, from 1965 to 1997. In 1972, he will change his name. And excuse me if I pronounce this poorly. It was change it to Mobutu Sisi Ck Kuku Niben Waza Benga, which translates to the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. And on that, we will end the session. If you have any questions, we just have a couple minutes. I'll take any questions if anybody has them. Otherwise, I will see you all hopefully around. And if not, I appreciated you giving me the time to talk to you.